So now we would like to go further and switch to our panel discussion. And before, I would like to introduce our moderator of today's discussion. It's Lucia Pietro-Justi. She's a curator working at the intersection of art, ecology, and systems. And she's curator of general ecology at the Serpentine Galleries in London that she founded, she programs and curates. She is also the curator of Sun and Sea Marina, the Lithuanian pavilion at the 58th Venice Biennial that is also going further on a tour. Name some of her projects. She is also a co-curator of Back to Earth, the Serpentine's 50th anniversary program, and also co-founder and co-curator of the Serpentine podcast. Her ongoing project includes The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, which is an interdisciplinary festival, radio and publication series on consciousness and intelligence across species. And she's also co-editor of More Than Human, together with André Jacques and Marina Otero-Versier, and further publications. So, Lucia, thank you so much for joining us today. For the public participants, I would like to ask you to switch your cameras off during the discussion because we will work with spotlights. And if you switch to the speakers view, then you can see all the speakers and panelists together. Please type your questions in the chat. I will make sure to collect them and pass them to the speakers after the panel discussion in our Q&A. And you will also, we will bring in these questions in the Q&A afterwards. So Lucia, thank you so much for joining. The floor is yours. Very welcome.
Thank you so much. Welcome all of you. Another huge thanks to Mira at ZKM for the hospitality. And I'm just so happy to welcome Diane Drubay, curator, artist, and founder of We Are Museums, Hicham Khalidi, director of the Jan van Eyck Academie in Maastricht, Farid Rakun, member of the artistic collective Ruangrupa and artistic co-director of Documenta 15, and Tino Sehgal, artist and co-curator of the Unplugged program Down to Earth at the Gropiusbau in Berlin in 2020. So today we are invited to consider the notion of reimagining institutions by thinking about structure, vision, and strategy. We will attempt to reflect on the notion of permacircularity, or a permacircular future for the arts, for art institutions, for the art environment, and for the environment at large, including those institutions we refer to commonly as museums, but also many others. So the art environment, of course, is a space for reflection, for imagination, and for speculation, certainly. It is also a space for enfleshment, for embodiment, for suggesting and enacting forms of change. And at the same time, we find ourselves prompted to immediate and non-rhetorical actions, particularly if we think about how art, including that art which itself addresses climate injustice or the climate crisis, may partake in more of the same. So rather than dedicating the session to forms of institutional critiques, our hopes for it were instead to reflect on spaces of agency of perhaps activities maybe at the fringes of, or indeed in the heart of, institutional frameworks which enact or care for or suggest some emergent and potential transformation. We will also, I hope, spend some time on the how. How are these things enacted in practice? Where are permacircular microcosms, so hard to say, permacircular microcosms being instantiated, and how? What are the principles that underhold them? What kinds of assemblages, or organizational structures can sustain differential and situated complex experience? And if barriers and difficulties have been encountered, what have they been? And how do we, like water that flows down a mountain, find alternative paths to the valley? There are also many questions that already came up from you all, the audience, through the Mentimeter in the last session that pertain to this panel. We've got those questions in mind, of course, questions around structure, around organization, around hierarchy, around collections. For now, you incredible and inspirational panelists, bring together practices that are artistic, curatorial, systemic, networked, and educational, somewhere at the porous threshold between action, praxis, and method, vision. And I hope we can dwell a little bit in this kind of strange space together. I know that tomorrow we'll see a couple of sessions that are dedicated to very practical and operationalizable tools for ecological or permacircular practice, although we may touch on these today as well. So in the first instance, thank you so much for being here and for sharing this time together. And I would like to begin by asking you, Tino, about Down to Earth, an unplugged program. I was struck when entering by this bizarre and perceivable change in kind of energy or atmosphere. I kept feeling like we were entering a space in which everyone all of a sudden started walking on carpet or on grass or on, in fact, neo-soil, as was the case for Asad Raza's piece. And I wanted to ask you if you could describe the project and how it responded to the sense of urgency, and also perhaps some practical examples of decisions that you took over the course of preparing the project.
So thank you, everybody, for taking your time, and thank you, Lucia, for your question and the invitation. Maybe before talking about Down to Earth, let me tell you a little bit about the motivation, to do something which is unplugged, which basically meant we didn't use electricity for the exhibition and we didn't fly. And we tried to switch off the climate control. But I think, somebody growing up in the 80s, the whole question about sustainability and ecology was very, very present already in the 80s when I was growing up as a child. And basically it had two instantiations. One was called greenhouse effect. The other one was called ozone hole, And now we call greenhouse effect climate crisis. There was a moment we called it climate change. And ozone hole, I don't even know how to properly say it in English anymore because it was solved. The problem was solved, more or less. And the reason, now what is the reason for this? Why is the one still there 30 years later? And why is the other one kind of vanished, And the thing is that the ozone hole problem was a problem which was basically down to a very few activities. It was this kind of substance called FCKW, I think. I don't know how to say that in English, FCKW, as we say in German. And they were in refrigerators, blah, blah, blah. Everybody knows this. And then we found surrogates for them. And then basically now the ozone layer is coming, kind of filling in again over New Zealand and Australia. So now we have then the greenhouse effect / climate crisis, which is, now what is the problem there is that every activity done by everyone emits carbon dioxide. So it becomes a little bit difficult to critique or to point fingers. Because, like the saying says, if you point at somebody, 4 fingers are still pointing at yourself, And so why the problem is conceptually also so difficult is because it asks us to change our entire patterns of behavior. So art is in principle, art is not a bad agent to participate in this, let's say, societal challenge. But the mode of critique, of course there's self-critique, but if you do self-critique for too long without actually doing something, you're either schizophrenic or you're in a melancholic posture. So I felt like when Thomas Oberender, let's say Director General of Berliner Festspiele and Gropiusbau, he wanted to do this project. And I said, okay, I'll participate, but then we really have to start with ourselves because we are the problem. That's always the case. We're always like in this kind of climate question were always the problem. So that's why we first looked at, because for me that's conceptually also important, you know, like that, like I tried to now explain the last couple of minutes, like that we don't point fingers, that we really admit that we are the problem, that we need to change, and that's also a practice and a training ground. It doesn't work like other discourses where you can say, oh, this group of people, this system. No, like it doesn't matter if it's, you know, it doesn't even matter if it's communism or capitalism. You know, any industrial culture kind of, you know, does this kind of extraction and transformation to carbon dioxide. So then yeah, like I said, it was relatively simple. It just we just said, okay, no electricity, so no videos and talks with microphones, and it's a very simple rule. But then you realize like you have to rethink every little step. You know, no lights. And then, you know, obviously people traveled by train for the first time, only having traveled by plane, and we're like. And I realized that that's where it's kind of uninteresting, but that's where the real problems are. Like, how do you take a train from Paris to Berlin? It's not that difficult, but people are still, adult people are, and this I learned over the years, are scared to do things like that because I haven't done it before. Like, what is a night train? How do you get on a night train? Do night trains exist? Why are some operated by the Russian railway between Paris and Berlin, and then suddenly they don't speak English, you know? All of this kind of stuff, which is really heavily banal, but nonetheless really, really strong in people's experience and people's concerns, you know? So we took a big effort on that. And then, yeah, we also did an effort. Then, of course, we looked at our own, you know, where does our energy actually go? And then, of course, we found out very quickly that 2/3 of the energy goes with the climate control. And then, so we tried to switch off the climate control, which then was met with a lot of resistance. Although there was only contemporary art in the building, then the concern was, and we might speak about this later, concern was that, you know, for an institution to kind of show its legitimation as an institution which can also borrow objects, needs to show, you know, like these kind of clean line of 20 degrees and 50% humidity all the time. And of course, if you switch off the climate control for, I don't know, 6 weeks, then it gives a bump, and then people will ask you and you'll get less loans or something like that. So although the protocol was so simple, you know, it ended up being quite difficult, you know, to instantiate a lot of things, and a lot of behavioral patterns have to change. And that was also my interest, because I think it really comes down to our behavioral patterns, you know.
Thank you so much. I actually wanted to ask you about, well, I mean, you've mentioned the infrastructure of the climate control, but I wanted to ask you about sort of lasting and permanent changes that the program may either have left behind or hope to leave behind.
I mean, I was a guest curator, and there have been a few emails actually in the recent days about like from individual projects, you know, which somehow continued. But I think, to me, it was clear from the beginning, you know, just the department that's booking the travels and doing an entire project and like having discussions with people who then in the end do want to somehow, you know, like travel in a different way than we're proposing, you know, like, and going through all of these kind of discussions, which are kind of discussions they never had before, you know, and booking trains and booking a ferry or something like that. Then of course it's difficult to go back to normal after you've had that experience, you know, like it's somehow embodied. And that's what I mean with like we all are governed by our habitual patterns. And once you start, and to work on them takes a little bit of time. It goes also more into the area of my work, you know. And so I think I have a sense for that it takes time and it takes effort to change this behavioral patterns. And I think you can't, once you start training one thing, you can't fully go back to where you were before, you know. And then with the climate control, we kind of more or less lost that battle. But then of course, with Thomas Oberender, we said, okay, but it's not only about our project. We'll try again the next time there's no exhibition, and then we'll make experiments, because of course people come with all kinds of arguments, you know, which at the end you might not have a full answer to, you know, but you just have to try it and take the risk, you know. And so, but I don't have a full answer to your question, but I think it's like this whole discourse. I think this is like the third kind of public event that I'm part of around this topic. And I think this discourse is also really helpful. And I see, you know, I've seen a couple of museum people in it. And I just think that also as museums, we're paid by the state, at least in Central Europe, Western Europe, we're paid by the state for the greater good. You know, that's the idea. And so we need to dedicate ourselves to the greater good. We can't say like, we're doing greater good here, but then in our backyard, we're kind of like greater good doesn't really matter. You know, like, so I think also it has some, like this whole question about the sustainability of museums has something to do with the credibility of museums. You know, like you have to show the actions to be able to speak, I think, in any situations. And that also goes for museums.
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the things that emerges very clearly is that those kinds of transformations in museum context take time, and they take quite a lot of kind of rehearsal, as you say, like developing a habit of mind is true for an individual, but also for an organization. I wanted to ask Diane, actually, because you are the founder of We Are Museums, which you describe as a community of museums good for people and planet. And I wanted to ask you about We Are Museums, how it was founded, and maybe some examples of activities over the last few years.
Yeah, thank you, Lucia, for the introduction. And I would like to thank you, the ZCAD team, and especially Barbara for inviting me, and Stefan for this very inspiring moment that we are in since the beginning of this afternoon. And thanks, Tino, for sharing your journey with the team of the Martin Gropius Bau. I actually noted a few terms that are actually also constantly in my daily life, which are fears, concerns, questions, like basically what is We Are Museums. It's a global community which started with international conferences now 8 years ago. But what I want to share today is that I really understood that if you want to help museums to change, you really need to face loneliness. I actually feel that loneliness is the main enemy of change. People really need to feel empowered to embrace change. They need much more than just inspiration and a list of best practices and guidelines. Like we actually understood that, this was actually not enough. Like, as I said, we've been organizing international conferences with a really diverse audience of museum professionals and museum workers. And we've been listening to them really for a decade. We identified really strong challenges. And these challenges that the museum system is actually facing today, they are very, very deep. And as you just said, they demand a lot of time, they demand bravery, and they demand a lot of work. And then if you add on top of these huge challenges, like the global challenges that we are facing today, you actually sit in front of a very complex challenge. And I actually believe that we are in this critical time. That's why I really like the term critical zone, but I feel that we are facing a really systemic fracture in the museum field. If we really want to see museums existing in the future, if we want museums to stay relevant for the next generation, they really need to start working together towards sustainable futures. And change should happen, as you said, Tino, at a very small practical level, but as well, all the body of the museum should change, and at a systemic level. I think it's really time to adopt new mindsets, values, models of thinking and doing, starting to think and work in a more collaborative way and purpose-driven with purpose-driven strategies. But we need to take the time to listen. We need to take the time to harvest different collective knowledge. And yeah, I believe that we need to give more space to randomness and to listen to the fringes and the peripheries. We need to find places where decentralization is key, and to let grassroots movement find their space and find their way. So I think that at We Are Museums, we really believe in this vision, like the vision of this new museum that we are starting to shape now. And we constantly say that they are this fabulous empowerment machine celebrating polyphony and positive citizenship. But again, it really demands togetherness, collaboration, time, and bravery, and that's quite quite tricky. That's why we need to fight this main enemy, which is loneliness, I think. I don't know. Do you want me to dive into projects?
I mean, maybe sort of potentially two general questions that it might be easier to discuss via a project, which is, as you were describing this, it occurs to me that I'd be really curious in your experience whether the kind of initiator of change within organizations and museums that you've worked with tends to be at governance level or at sort of, I don't want to say grassroots within the context of an organization, but at sort of as a result of an upswell of multiple other agents that might not be a governance level, if those museums are indeed constructed in a kind of hierarchical way.
Well, I believe that now, for the past 5 years, we start to see really beautiful museum managers who actually embrace this new positive thinking. But to start with, most of the time, because these kind of new museum directors are just like I can count maybe 10. Normally, to start with, it's actually one person being inspired by another industry, being inspired by another community, feeling empowered to actually say loud that something that the museum is doing is not really right, or that something should be changed. And I think we can actually talk about grassroots in the museum, because it's actually mostly working like that. So it is this kind of spaces that we try to give to museum professionals at We Are Museums. But I'm also navigating in so many others, just like Museums for Future. It's the branch of Fridays for Future. In this space, in this free space, you also empower museum professionals to change something in their own institution. In my daily life, I try to actually go in different communities. I'm also really involved in a clean NFTs community, which is all about decentralization, and it's creating this grassroots change as well. So I think diversity and polyphony are really essential if you want to empower this person to actually create movement and then create more movement. And I think to summarize what we do at We Are Museums, we really try to enable the enablers, trying to actually give enough strengths and threads to this person who is having a dream or who actually wants to say loud something, so they can actually create some waves of change and transformation.
Thank you so much. So moving a little bit from museum institutions to the International Biennale format, a question for Farid. This appointment of ruangrupa to steward really Documenta 15 marks really quite a radical reimagination about the possibilities, but also responsibilities of this International Biennale format. And I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit about ruangrupa's approach to Documenta as an institution, perhaps, and how collectivity and your kind of collective structure plays a part in this.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Lucia, for the question. And then thank you for everyone, including Stefan and the KM team, for having me here, and also other panelists. Looking forward to hear more and talk more with you afterwards. But answering your question, Lucia, trying at least. to answer that question. I think like it's also necessary to explain that I'm coming from a context where museums and art institutions, let's say, are not that strong. It doesn't have that strong history. The kind of like the grip to the culture is not that strong either. That's also why we could build what we did, you know, up until now. A lot of times right now, of course, looking back, we see this fact as actually a fortunate one, you know, as a positive side of where we're coming from. So I think like there are certain things or burden, if you can say so, that kind of like institutions and museums, let's say in Central Western Europe, have that we actually kind of like don't. So we're a bit more used to those qualities that I think like was mentioned before by Diane. I think like be more adaptive, be more improvisational, give more time on things, etc. And then I have to say as well that like there's a lot of talk or questions about collectives these days, more than before, to us at least. But we have to say as well, like knowing and having practiced collectivity, our type of collectivity for 20 plus years, we have to say as well that it's not a magic pill or it's not like a recipe that could work with everywhere, you know? So when that opportunity started to come to us of like thinking about and working with Documenta, we didn't have that burden maybe as like a lot of Europeans would, or like a lot of like people in the art world would, because like most of us never visited Documenta even, you know, and then we knew that it was happening. It happened every 5 years or all those kind of stuff, and it's important, of course. But we like in what I think like what I like to call that understanding or like affect. Like we didn't feel it, you know. Like it's much more like to understand what could we do if Documenta is part of our ecosystem, and then what could we do as well to make sure that what we were doing at that moment, we just opened Good School, for example, with other practice in Jakarta, would not be stopped for a bit and then work for Documenta and then come back to it, you know? So we were not extracted from our context, let's say, or our own ecosystem, but how can we share this opportunity further to people? First, of course, the people we knew from before, that we trust from before, etc., and then slowly building up and then expanding this rare opportunity, because I don't know, I would say it's rare. We didn't think that Documenta would ever do anything with something like ruangrupa before, for example, or a context of like Indonesia. But yeah, so that's how we think. Like there is an institution like Documenta with its own history, context, responsibility, as you said, and it in itself is a resource. And then there's a type of sensibility that come like us, you know, like from other type of sensibility, and then how to work together, and then how to, this is pre-pandemic as well, you know, how to actually do, at least from our side, kind of like extend this responsibility that we put to ourselves, also using Documenta as an opportunity to extend this type of practices, let's say, and sensibilities, test it out, whether it's working, whether it's not, but like thinking that what we're doing right now is not only for documenta, it actually kind of helps a lot.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about Lumbung. So you described the sort of practice of Lumbung as a kind of metaphor for a certain set of situated knowledges and practice and attentiveness and care for what is there. But Lumbung itself is also a real and situated practice. And I tend to, every time I hear a metaphor for something, I'm really interested in like the object, the actual material thing that the metaphor comes from. So I wanted to ask you about, so you described it as a collective pot or accumulation system used in rural areas of Indonesia where crops produced by a community are stored as a future shared common resource and distributed according to jointly determined criteria. And I wanted to ask you, what is the status of Lumbung in rural areas today, and how can that itself inform maybe the challenges and possibilities of the documenta metaphorical Lumbung?
Yeah, I'll try to be as precise as I can. Like, it's vernacular, Lumbung. If you talk to any Indonesians, they know what Lumbung is, you know. So it's not ours, it's not it's not an invention, let's say. And then even like right now, the government even like use it as well for Lumbung Pangan, which means like food Lumbung, in order for Indonesia to reach like food sovereignty, etc., etc. So there are a lot of use, let's say. And then in agricultural terms, so it's not only rural, but as long as it's agricultural, then it's there. Also, like even using it for other type of resources, let's say. But there's still some. You're right. Like in certain villages, of course, they're still using it, but a lot of villages are capitalistic already as well. And then if for those who it needs to be introduced for Indonesian social context, it's like this is as free market as you can get, or in certain things, you know, including real estate, so property. Like a lot of these agricultural terms are not working anymore because they don't even, like farmers don't even have land anymore. You know, they work for other people's land, etc., etc. Not exclusively happening here, but like so the understanding though, although it's not practiced that popularly anymore, a lot of people still practice it, but like it's not as omnipresent as before. But like the understanding got translated even into urban life, middle class, all those kind of stuff in how we organize or even proliferate certain resources. A lot of times it's money this time, you know, especially in urban, but like rural as well. But that resource is capital, let's say, understood as capital, no longer as knowledge, for example. Space is capital as well, so a lot of times it's still being used, but like those intangibles are missing a lot of times, which we're trying to reclaim in order to do it, because like in a lot of our practice, a lot of tacit things or intangible things are being played in. So it's when we talk about resources, even like documentized resources, you know, a bank of resources, we want to push it to that understanding of resources, not only talking about money, time, space, etc., but like even things that kind of like that overlooked. Knowledge is one, but that's kind of like the more clear one. But how to co-govern, let's say, how to co-govern something like documenta with its history, with its responsibilities, with its possibility, with its spotlight, etc., etc., that's being played out right now, let's say. And we kind of like set the protocols in the beginning, but to be honest, right now, which I'm very grateful about right now, is actually a lot of people took that leading role. So what they think is important or priority, they put it in the table, and then everyone has a say on it, let's say. Sorry of being too abstract still.
No, thank you so much. Okay, last but absolutely definitely not least, Hicham, in your role as the director of the Young Van Eyck Academy, you have introduced definitely programs, visions, and initiatives that have transformed not only the activities of the Academy, but also I kind of sense crucially as sort of its sense of purpose. And I was particularly struck by what you described as the vision to align the Academy to the IPCC 1.5 degree targets, and wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Lucia, nice to meet you. My co-panelist, so wonderful to be here. I'm speaking here from the Young Van Eyck. Thank God we can be here physically. People are working here, so that's really great. Yeah, and thank you for this introduction. I don't know if I would make it as explicit as you say, that we've been putting forward all of these intentions, let's say. One can debate whether we are doing well or whether we are succeeding or not. There is a lot of debate going on here at the Academy also because of the things that we put forward. And I feel amongst friends also confirmed maybe also with this intention, idea and feeling and hope in order to really put this larger issue on the agenda, which is climate change, in fact, or the climate crisis, as you will. So when I came in here, which was in 2018, so one of those first things was to sort of put the special report 1.5 degrees as central to thinking of what a residency as the Young Van Eyck could be. That's it, basically. And the rest followed, in fact. So how does one then work from that kind of quite practical approach towards what it means to be an academy, or for that matter, to be a supportive system for artists who reside here, and what does it mean for art practice in general? So that's basically the question, and out of that you can sort of start to build up structures or programs or things like that. And so we're 2 years later, and it's still a lot of debate going on and a lot of tensions, obviously, which I completely understand also between these notions and the feelings that people have, the corona crisis that sort of cut through everything, which in fact also, as Farid said, I mean, for me, the corona crisis came as sort of a perfect moment. I mean, that sounds crazy, but it was sort of, after the corona crisis, the idea of urgency suddenly was not debated anymore. Everybody felt it. This is urgency. This is how it feels like. So it was quite more easy for me sort of to put this idea of climate change on the table, although it's devastating. On the other hand, it has made things more difficult in the sense that we've been hit in the thing that we are best in, you know, having people from all over coming here to interact with each other. We've been hit in our communion, in our being a community. So how does one build up this community within these situations of urgency or crisis, as one can say? So for me, the corona crisis was also sort of the canary in the coal mine, right? And can we utilize it? And this is also something I'm trying to push also within policy making, also within the stakeholders that we work in, with the partners. Come on, you know, this is our moment. We need to take this moment. So that's one part. And so this alignment to the IPCC, the policy report 1.5 degrees. I mean, yesterday there was the report of the WMO, and you know, we're at target 1.2 now, and Kenya is at 1.8. You know, so there's this huge urgency, this heat in the neck. So what can we do with that? And so that's basically the question: is so how can you perform yourself as an artist or as an art practitioner within this idea of urgency? So how will those 10 years that we have, the 2030 target, let's say, affect you in your ways of working. Then it's very interesting to hear Tino talk about his approach at the Gropiusbau. So that's basically it. That's sort of the alignment to the IPCC, and which we could give form, right, when we started making the public programming, and we proposed the urgency intensive as sort of a central part in that. So every year we would have a moment where we would gather a multi-day event, let's say, and we would talk about these issues. This year we were able to, thanks to also Bruno Alves-Alameda, our curator, and Lina Lace, who invited the vice chairs of the IPCC. So we had 2 vice chairs also present at the urgency intensive, which is sort of a 12-hour session, right? So it's intense. It's online as well if you want to view it. And also within that, we played sort of a role play between the future and the present, where the future would be 7 generations further. And it was such a beautiful moment to hear the future giving us hope that we will make it. We only need that, right? We only need sort of a message of hope from anywhere. We just need to envision it in order to get there. So it's a very imaginative process, let's say, of what we are in. Yeah, that's it, I suppose.
Thank you. I did actually see a big part of the IPACC after the fact, and was so excited, particularly by that sort of both the kind of speculative and long-term, deep time, I suppose, outlook that it took, but also for this beautiful way that the subject matter and methodology kind of align. And I wanted to maybe ask you a question about risks. Given that my second question to you was going to be about the IPACC, but you've just mentioned it, maybe we can just jump straight into risk, which is how do you square off a dedication to the environmental, let's say, justice and balance, or the IPCC 1.2 or 5 degree target, with the risk of deploying environmentally conscious methodologies, particularly or only or in the first instance with environmentally themed things. So this like beautiful union can also then end up being a kind of an unentangable thing, right?
Yeah, can you rephrase it? Because is this between, let's say, the focus and the artists, their practice themselves? Is this sort of the...
Yeah, I'm just wondering if at large, not necessarily in the Jan van Eyck, but sort of what is the risk of ending up being incredibly environmentally conscious, only in environmentally themed programs, and how do we then like...
Well, first of all, I mean, the alignment wasn't sort of a proposition or approach to thematize the climate crisis. It has never been like that. I mean, it's a principle accord, it's an ethical question, right? So, and with that, it's quite a radical approach, in fact, because in fact you would have to go through the whole system. You would have to go through your board of directors. You would have to go through your stakeholders. You have your partners, you know, the financiers. To be honest with you, the external part was more easy than the internal part. I mean, the most difficult one is, and I felt that with Tino maybe, is that like with the climate control, I adhere to that. Is this when you have people coming here with an idea to develop their practice, right? Then it's about their practice. You know, they are central to that. And I think you can project that to maybe the larger problem that we also see in the Corona crisis. How do we engage people within such large thing as a Corona or as a climate crisis? So how do you change behavior? But you can't change behavior. You have to bring people together. You have to bring people together to change each other's behavior. This is a common thing. It's a community thing. It's not something that you can oppose or push. So that's the main challenge. Is sort of how does one bridge this idea of being here to develop your practice, and artists that are also, and fairly enough, here also to make that next step, or to develop their work, or to make productions for exhibitions. And this is the support system that we offer, and then we need to offer that, and this is important. How do you bridge that with a larger focus that is sort of trying to change the structures of the system while another system is still in place, right? And so that's the big challenge, and that's the same challenge as we have societally, in the society at large, that we see here in a micro scale. So it's impossible to thematize it. I mean, you look at it in a practical way, you look at it in a conceptual way, you look at it in an ethical way, and you need to adhere to change, but that change cannot come by just pushing it. You can't push it. You have to have that communion. You have to talk about it. You have to have the conversations. You have to have the struggle. You have to go through it. Yeah, that's basically what I experienced.
Thank you for sharing. And I'm also conscious that whilst I would love for us to be able to get into the actual, like, where are the bits that you have to push against, those are also really ones that are easier to have over in smaller groups, non-recorded, than they are in a public context. But let's say moving into sort of tricks, speaking about the elephant by going around the elephant, moving into the kind of tricks and spaces of unexpected agency. Can I ask you all, any of you who wants to take the floor first, to sort of speak about whether you've experienced any specific sort of spaces of unexpected agency or tricks and strategies that allowed you to get from the beginning of something to some kind of environmentally conscious, just, or transformative change?
I mean, two things came to my mind listening just now. I think that because I hope, and I've seen a few museum people here, and I think one, let's say, trick on a more strategic, less practical level is, that I think, museums, theaters, concert hall were like, let's say, the privileged sites of the production of culture until, let's say, 10 years ago, right? So now this privilege has fallen, which I personally think is a good thing. And we're back to how culture was most often in culture, where everybody produces culture and you can post it via social media. So in a way we have like museums, concert halls, theaters have lost a kind of lost importance, on a societal level. So I think there's also in this sustainability thing, like any institution has a problem with this, and museums are behind, but they're relatively small institutions, and I think, talking about museums as sites where we think and act around the greater good, I think there's a chance also for museums to regain importance, saying, okay, we're going to take this extremely serious, and by that we're going to also show how it works. How do you actually make an institution more sustainable? Like, what is also and this goes also back to what you said at the very beginning about down to earth, that you felt like walking on grass or a carpet. I think that often we think about these changes of patterns of how to do things, of habits, as something like a deprivation. But the reality is that often it's actually refreshing, like, for example, opening the windows, like, why should we be in a climate controlled room? That's very modernist. And I don't want to get into that whole thing where we kind of like separate ourselves from what is around us. Like, actually, if you open the window, you hear the birds, you have a breath of air, and then there's like a work of art next to you. It's not a bad thing. And if that work of art is not going to be harmed by it, it's all okay. And so I think that there's also a chance for museums, like, let's say, although they're behind in the race, but to find a new role in society where their role is not just privileged producers of culture, but also to just show how you can operate in this society. So I hope that can motivate maybe people. Then I think from an art side, I think the ethics of producing an artwork never harmed an artwork. I mean, if there's artists here, and I don't know, but like, I think some people say, I want to do this. I mean, my own experience from my trajectory is that, like, mostly when you give yourself restriction, you say, like, I don't want to do something which is harmful, like it ends up being a better work, and a better exhibition or whatever you do, So I think these kind of constraints, I wouldn't just push them aside. But anyway, that just those are the thoughts that came to mind in terms of your question about tricks.
Thank you. Farid or Diane, do you want to take this notion of tricks, resistances, places of agencies where they were unexpected?
Go ahead, Farid. I actually feel that what you just explained, is exactly what we are facing on a daily basis, which is this fracture. And that's actually this systemic fracture. Like, you really have one part of the museum field, which is actually driven by what is not necessary anymore or won't be really necessary in the future. And then you have this other part, which is actually becoming the heartbeat of what will become the next society. And it's actually like, we really see museums as these places to reflect, to be transformed. It's this kind of big social laboratory, actually, where you can really have these polyphonic visions and discussions. And that's exactly the kind of vision of the future of museum that we are having. And like with We Are Museums, and I also wanted to catch up on what you said, Farid, that you are actually diving into indigenous practices to inform museum practices. With We Are Museums, we've been diving into nature thinking and nature models. And it is actually the concept of the biodiversity of a forest, actually, which inspired us to find new ways for museums to have symbiotic relationships with their neighbors. So that's just one example among others, because we are researching different things on different levels. But a trick could be actually to always look outside of your bubble and to always look for, what is the unknown, always look at the fringes and the peripheries, look at nature, look at indigenous cultures, because everything, most of things should be actually reframed and reinvented if we really want to see museums in the future. So I was really happy to hear you, Tino, say that. It's really what we believe in.
Farid?
Yeah, I think like continuing from what Diane and Tino was saying as well. What I can share is maybe an analogy. Like I'm living in Jakarta, like one of the places that's sinking the fastest on the face of the earth, So in 2050, I think like statistics differs. It depends on where you're looking at, but like maybe even up until 30% of the city in 2050 will be under the water. And then like, of course, like the technological answer to it is actually like, which is being done in majority, it's like that, like how to keep that to not happen, mitigate or preemptively attack a problem. But I think like if we don't make it into like a not a thematic approach, let's say, analogously. So it's not like a problem that's kind of like siloed from everywhere else, from anything else. So, but it's actually kind of like for everyone to think about. Maybe it's actually better to live with it. And then like in this analogy of Jakarta, maybe it's better to live with water instead of fighting it, But then for us, what we're doing with this question of climate change, sustainability, climate crisis, etc., I think like it's good to think about it as a holistic problem, and then like and make it like in architecture as well. I'm sorry that because like that's my previous background. Like the ideal is not to make new standards of sustainability, let's say, but it is kind of like a thing that's given. So as if like, it needs to be structurally sound. A building needs to be structurally sound. It shouldn't fall. So a building should not add into the problem. It's good if we can provide a solution to it, but at least that we can do is not to add to the problem. But it's kind of like difficult to put it into practice. I understand. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You all know, panelists, that I had about 87 other questions to ask you, and we seem to have only a few minutes left before the Q&A. So I'm just going to jump straight to the hopes question, I think, the most dreaming one, and maybe starting by asking you, Hicham, if you can imagine having played a part in something, and looking back from 2030, where is that place where you would like to be? What is it that you would like to have seen happen or played a part in happening?
Sure. Is that me or the institution? I mean, I would like to be on a beach having a drink. But I suppose, I don't know. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine, right? I mean, look at the Corona crisis. I mean, you can't even imagine further than, you know, thinking of the things that you can and cannot do. Huh? So you can't plan anymore. And this is one of the things that the crisis does, right? It takes away the horizon. One of the other ways the imagination does work, because you can imagine yourself, as I said, when the future speaks to you and is giving you hope in an imaginative way, this gives you really hope. And maybe this is also connected to indigenous thinking. Maybe this is also where the seventh generation thinking comes from. You know, you give to the future, but the future is connected to you. In fact, it's like the past, as they say in decoloniality. And that is super interesting. So it's difficult for me to imagine myself in 2030. The only thing that I can imagine is that at the moment I feel that we will exacerbate the conflictuous situation that we are in. This is going to go on. At a certain point, we have to come together. And this will provide us a new form. I feel we are in transition, as you already said. You can feel it. It's there. So that's what I imagine, that this transition has sort of a moment in which that most important thing is coming together, realizing, being with, will be manifested, and manifested more than it is now, because that's what I think. So that question of hope is for me very important. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else want to jump on the hope question? Don't say no. Hope together.
Is that, you know, there's this feeling of transition you feel in the different, let's say, strata of education. You have, I mean, I did a lecture at the Chelsea College Monday, and then we did sort of a survey amongst all the students, and we asked them sort of, would you like the radical approach or the harboring approach, right? So more than half chose radical. So these are like the young peoples going towards, you know, I mean, the residents that we have here are about 32. I mean, so they've already done quite some things. Huh? So they need to transition from their world that they're used to something else. Huh? So their art practice is already going. So that's more difficult. So they might, you know, choose not so radical, or they might be taken aback by this, because I do feel that you know, you have to imagine that people already feel sort of in a precarious situation. The artists are in a precarious situation. They are the precariat, let's say, and because the climate crisis also entails the opening up of the spaces of the inequalities that are present in the world. I mean, much of the CO2 output is done by the West. Much of the people that bear the biggest brunt of the climate crisis, they have nothing to do with it, in fact. So especially the tropical areas. So there's this inherent inequality in it. So this kind of inequality you will see as well, and it becomes apparent. So, but then again, as I say, if you look at the younger generation, I suppose that they are much more adapted already, for instance, to have a more ethical approach within their work, or this kind of thing. So that gives hope as well, I suppose.
Lucia, I think we should also switch now to the Q&A. I think if you still have some questions, I think we can still consider one or two questions, because we don't have a lot of questions in the chat yet. We are collecting still, but so we have like time, I think, for one or two questions.
Can I just leave another 5 seconds of silence to figure out whether Tino, Diane, or Farid have 2030 hope to share?
Yes, sure.
Tino,
I can say something. I think that, like, you know what, we had a preparatory Zoom for this, you know, which kind of was an interesting format. And I think that just when you have to change your behavior, right? When you have to change your habit, it hurts, right? It's not a pleasant thing. So anybody, any institution, any individual will try to find a way out, you know? And I'm wary, like, as somebody who's been busy and motivated by that topic since 30 years, you know? And I never felt like it was a matter of talking about things, of doing what the art world is specialized in, and what it's good for is creating great and grand discourses around it. Now, like in recent years, it's starting, but the art world, one has to admit, always had a real kind of wasn't comfortable with this topic, didn't want to take this topic on board, you know? And so, like, any kind of question, which is to me a little bit going away from the actual, what can you practically do? Switch off your climate control, you know, like, is going back into our own habits, which is we produce discourse, we produce models, we produce cultural events, you know? And that's also a practical, and that's why I don't really want to react to it, you know, because it's not a critique of you, but I just, it's been 30 years, you know, let's really do something. Then we can talk again. Then we can go back to the usual channel. But why it's also, which came out in this conversation, like between the lines, you can hear from many of us, you know, it's the internal is not so easy. Why is the internal not so easy? Yeah, it's people's habits, blah, 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 like I just said, but it's also because it's not the core mission. A cultural institution's core mission is to produce cultural events. Basta.
Yeah. But I was just wondering, Tino, because you in your own practice, you have always, as I understand, and knew that you don't fly, and that you already in the beginning, and that you, I mean, in your practice, you use your body. So in that sense, how does that differ from the many practices that we know in which you have materials use, you have transports of goods, you have all of that whole apparatus?
I mean, in terms of my own work, the starting point was like, because I came more from a like kind of sustainability movement background than from an arts background, you know?
Right.
And I realized that I realized that culture is like the site of the construction of values. And the real problem was the values in the 80s and 90s, you know? And so I realized like, I want to do something which doesn't use material, because any kind of usage of material in its kind of fundamental modality is the creation of carbon dioxide. This material has always been extracted somewhere. It's always been processed somewhere. It will always have to be recycled. So for example, what I said in the early 2000s was also, you know, dance, speaking, singing has this simultaneity of production, deproduction, right? Like I do a movement, it's something, you can interpret it if you like, but it's already deproduced. You don't have to recycle it. It didn't use more carbon dioxide than the fact of me breathing, you know? So, I mean, I don't want to make this about my own work, but I just think that that's my general sentiment, like we talked about in the
But do we need to consider that? Is it something that we, as an academy, as art academies, do we need to consider our output, our CO2 output, our energy input, our energy output? Do we need to transition to start speaking of these circularities, as the title also claims? This is circularity, in and output.
If you want to be contemporary, yes. And the thing is called contemporary art. So it's difficult to be contemporary art without being contemporary, you know? And the model of the 20th century is not in the 19th century. The idea of 19th century is like, you know, you extract resources from Gaia, you transform them, you shoot lots of carbon dioxide in the air, And the more goods you produce like that, the happier you are. Like that model is not sustainable. It's not materially, ecologically, it's not really psychologically sustainable. So if you want to be contemporary, you have to kind of come to a different modality, yes. Maybe you can get away with doing it in the 19th and 20th century way, but I don't think it's going to last for too long, you know? So, yeah.
So it does come with pain, as you say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I may,
I don't know, or with joy, like Lucia said, you know, she had a good feeling, or like I took it as a compliment with like the grass and the carpet when she walked in there, because you feel a different vibe. I think that also what this moment, you know, which was not possible really in the 90s, like we have a much more kind of openness to the idea of energies and frequencies, you know. So if you do something from a certain attitude, a certain kind of, an attitude is a frequency, you know. If I put myself into a certain ethical attitude, you will sense that in the room, is my belief, you know, and it will come out through any action or any construction you put into the room.
Yeah. Interesting.
I saw Diane having a comment to this.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that last year was actually an amazing crash test for the museum field, because we actually saw super clearly some museums producing even more content, which most of them were not really relevant or not really used or seen. And then you actually saw some other museums just listening to the neighbors, just changing everything that they were doing and changing and showing that their intention, their goal is actually not content, but it's people. And I think last year, unfortunately, it made things very, very obvious. So yeah, just wanted to say that we are really facing this huge fracture. And again, I agree with you. Yeah, just talking and not saying it is, and not doing, it's really something that we've seen last year. A lot of museums actually taking the newspaper headlines, but then not really talking to local communities or to artists or to people really suffering, and to asking spaces to reflect or to feel more comfortable. Last year was an amazing crash test, unfortunately.
Yeah, amazing.
Can I ask Farid if you have a last comment before we open to the question?
Maybe I just want to revisit what Tino said, and Hicham as well, about the pain, the internal pain or the internal struggle. Like, because if you want to go this way, like a lot of things, also like Diane, maybe like a lot of changes are actually invisible. It's maintenance work, it's care, it's like also about, you know, banal things and quotidian things, all those kind of stuff. When the question of like the expectation of artworks, let's say, still what I'm borrowing Tino's term of like the understanding of 19th and 20th century. How could we actually like bridge this kind of gap in understanding? Because like these invisible works and boring, etc., it's kind of like vital right now. But then I don't know whether people want to hear that, you know. So how to do it in a sense of like maybe in 2030 that it would not be boring anymore. I don't know, but or it's like common practice already. But coming back to your first question, Lucia, but like I'm just wondering whether about tricks, and I just want to learn about other people's experiences here on how to think about that.
Thank you. Daria, I believe.
Yeah, I think it's a good moment to bring in some questions that we got in the chat. There haven't been so many questions, so you please feel free to pose your questions in the chat. We'll try to bring in in. In the live stream, we collected questions on the Mentimeter, and there have been some voices also asking us to reflect further on 2 questions from the Mentimeter. Barbara and Sabina Enea-Teari asked us to take up the following question. How can human institutions acknowledge, represent, include non-human, more than human voices? And this is a question that goes to everybody. So if you feel like reacting to it, please do.
Yeah, maybe I can say something. I mean, we have so many positions here. I mean, we have 46 artists a year. And I mean, it goes from working with fermentation, so bacteria or yeast, or, you know, working with lichens, or working, you know, so there's so many positions, so many ways of having an interaction with non-human entities, let's say, and very needed interaction as well. So this is a process that is I suppose going on, and has been worked on for a long time, I suppose, also from the ecological spectrum in the 60s, 70s, going towards what's happening now. But so in that sense, yeah, there's a lot of artists, at least here, that work on that.
Probably that's a good moment also to show some pictures from Van Eyck Academy that you sent us in advance. So I would like the technical host to show the videos, the pictures. Probably you could also tell us briefly what is there.
Yeah. I mean, this is just to maybe if people don't know Diane Van Eyck, and then they can just see what we do. But I mean, we have 3 gardens. So a forest garden and sort of a project garden where artists do many different things. They take clay out of the ground and make things with it. Or now we have we're having a vegetable garden. We're having ducks as well at the moment. And next to that, you know, this question of, and that's why I wanted to pose that question, what it means to be radical, what it means to, what do you put forward? How do you support artists? Do you support them, or do you put forward kind of a notion or an idea of how to do it? And at the moment, I think there should be a structure of a conversation between, on the one hand, the different positions that artists have and coming from, because they apply not with the notion that they are going to be working on the climate crisis or working on ecological matters. They apply from their work, and we should support them in that. But can we have a conversation between that and then, you know, the institutional focus, or that thing that we all should do, in fact, you know, this alignment with the crisis that is going on? So in that sense, that's the big question, sort of. What will this conversation be? And how we approach it is sort of to support, to give those possibilities, like the gardens or the Future Materials Bank, for instance, which was set up by Jasmin Ostendorf before she left for the Green Art Lab Alliance, which is sort of a database of ideas and materials that artists can choose and be inspired by or stimulated by to work a little bit more ecological. So those are sort of hints in that sense. So that's basically what we try to do. We try to offer, and then we'll see what happens afterwards. And then there's a lot of issues like the practicalities of the building. And I love to sort of also talk about, you know, if you switch off the climate control, what other ways are there? Yeah, opening windows when it's hot, wearing a sweater when it's, you know, cold. But this is true. I mean, you can have Fridays wearing sweater day, you know? Why not? You can have a whole practice making beautiful sweaters. But, you know, you're going back to a practice that we've had like 1,000 years ago, or maybe 500 years ago, or 100 years ago. Maybe this is what we need to do. Maybe we need to also inform about survival. How can we survive? How can we maintain ourselves? How can we sustain ourselves beyond the networks that are present, beyond the grids, beyond the... So this could also be... I was thinking maybe even not make a difference anymore between the artistic practice that produces, let's say, content or produces artworks, but, you know, the relationship art and life, sort of production of human beings and the production of life, the production of humanity. Maybe this is also a way forward. So I don't know. It's all questions.
Yeah, there are questions about questions and our questions. Yeah, but probably somebody else would like to react to the question how we can include non-human agents into the institutional system.
I mean, first of all, I mean, like, can I say something? I mean, I think it's a good question. I think first you have to start with the format. It's not only like Hicham has talked about artworks, and of course that's something which is kind of, one tends to see a lot, I would say, at the moment, and that's a good thing. But a lot of the current philosophy, like Haraway or Latour, is basically, comes from the line of tradition of Alfred North Whitehead. And, Whitehead's big point is the bifurcation of nature and culture, that we separate so clearly between nature and culture, which then Latour has shown, it doesn't really work, it doesn't really exist. That's why his book is called We've Never Been Modern, because this is another way of saying we've never been modern, is nature and culture have never been separate. You cannot separate these things. So now if you look at the White Cube or the museum, now what is it? It's exactly such a place which tries to push out any kind of influence from other agents. And only humans can control the conditions which are in these spaces, right? And nothing from the outside should come inside, and vice versa, more or less, So I think this question also puts into questions, like the formats that art happens in, and that, I think my opinion, like one of the best, artworks of the last 10 years was Pierre Weig's Until the Documenta 13. And it's no coincidence that it was not in a white cube, and that you couldn't really see where it starts and where it ends, because it was woven in, almost like it grew out of where it was, and to me, that seems like a contemporary artwork. And I think, this, the kind of human exceptionalism, to put it maybe in a little bit pointed way, is like the white cube is a little bit of a monument to that, so it also calls into question, like where we do this thing that we call art, or is this thing, is this thing that something, is this game we call art, which hasn't always existed, like painting, sculpture, architecture, theater, dancing, singing, that has always existed, role play, yeah. But art, is a relatively new notion, if you take it in the strict sense. It comes, without going deeply into museum studies, but it comes basically with the advent of museums. So it's also a game we can choose not to play anymore, because we think, that comes with a lot of presuppositions that are not really okay anymore today, like the division between nature and culture.
But would you say, I mean, that's the presentation of art, right? So that's the display of art. That is would you say that is, I suppose that art in its sense of expression has always been there. I mean, in a sense of speaking, voicing, speech, as you say, singing, dancing, all of that, right? But when you bring that back to the presentation, the display of art, then I suppose then that is connected to museums and yeah.
I mean, yeah, I'm not sure I 100% understood you, and I don't want to talk too long, but maybe one or two more sentences. When you say the word presentation, Hicham, or display, those are, in my mind, already very loaded notions,
Sure.
Because they are already in a way, Kantian, Cartesian, here am I, here's the world, I present something to you, If you think of the word celebration or situation or ritual, immediately think of something we do together, and not in this subject-object antagonism or nature culture, or, all these kind of binaries that our culture, operates on or used to operate on. And that's why I say, we can also think about the notion art in general. That goes a little bit far, and it's very far. It's maybe the furthest away from something really practical, like switching off the climate control.
Yeah.
If I may add something, we actually have done a research on the concept of permeability and on how museums could actually get inspired by permeability in natural elements to think about their spaces differently. And it's in permeability is just like the skin and the skin of the elephant. It's actually just a question of morphism, porosity, and overlaps. And so we've been talking about that with Cara Curate from Tate, and she will actually be speaking at the symposium tomorrow. But it is actually what they have done with Tate Exchange, which is actually giving this empty space to different kind of initiatives. It is also something that the Anchorage Museum in Alaska has done. Julie Decker, the director, basically decided to remove one space which was dedicated to temporary exhibitions and potential money-making exhibitions to actually give this empty space to any kind of events for the local communities to actually celebrate indigenous culture. So I would think that if you want to get inspired by nature, you have to give empty spaces, you have to give freedom for, as I said before, randomness and last minute need of space and need to raise a voice. That's one thing that we also learn from nature.
Yeah, thank you so much, Diane. Also in the critical zones, we speak also so much about thinking as individuals, not as separate entities, but that we are porous, that we have skin that is permeable in both directions, and that we are basically not individuals, but overlapping and probably or enfolding other organisms in us. And probably it would be also fruitful to think in this context also about institutions that we somehow loosen this categorization and framing, but think in more porous also sense, opening up some things for different new things to come also. We have here another question that is more from Pooja Ganwar and the question is addressing democratization in the museums. So Pooja writes, the privileged produce culture of museums. What could be some ways of democratizing the culture, the artworks, and in the museums and in the institutions? So it's completely different, of course, probably strand of the conversation, but I still wanted to bring in this question. Probably you would like to react. I don't know, Farid, would you like to say something about this?
Yeah, no, I'm digesting what's been said before, and I think like also I'm trying to kind of like maybe the concepts are convoluted right now in my head, but yeah, the main also like I think Lucia was in our previous emails correspondence talking about scale as well. I think that for us, that's always like the one of the answers. Like, don't go big, basically. If you just like, if as an institution, a lot of times institution put or like put a mandate to itself of being international from the beginning, for example, or for being global. And then problems arise from that, but it's not a consequence, but it is kind of like not a consequence that you can put Band-Aid on. That's what I'm saying. Like a lot of times from where we're standing, these questions arise as looking for Band-Aid solution, not like so it's skin deep, you know, like although like the problems a lot of times, and I learned it from other indigenous practices as well, the problems with a lot of institutions are actually in the bones, you know. Of course, they're not being hospitable to their neighbors, because that's not their audience to begin with, you know, in their head. It's not their audience to begin with. Their audience is always like somewhere in other parts of the world, let's say, or something like that. So I think like for us, keeping things small and long term is actually kind of like a way to go. In that way that you can, what you said, Diane, you know, like you can absorb those kind of like reactionary and then, you know, being more improvisational, random, all those kind of stuff much easier. It's not a dinosaur that cannot move anymore, you know. If you're a dinosaur, of course, it's hard for you to move from one field to another. But if you're small and agile, I think like that's one of the keys, as well as, let's say, understanding of artworks, because there are a lot of questions. If I skim through, it's also kind of like addressing that, like the understanding of art and artwork. I think that's a problem as well, which cannot be answered like what Tino and Hicham were talking about before. I think it's like it's fundamental how we see and how we appreciate. What if for us, art is never being disciplined as well. So from between mediums as well as like it's never autonomous. So it's always like playing a part in everyday's life. So we never question of like what's the function of art, let's say. That's very, very Western institutional question, if I may. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Farid. I think the question of scale also is super, super important, and we will have tomorrow this panel on mobility and practices that will also tackle these considerations. I would like probably to include one or two questions more, because we need to move forward. And there is a question about how can we combine this greening of museum structures with better paying artists, or like with also rethinking of a situation for artists, and rethinking remuneration structures for artists that are basically still largely dependent on trying to feed non-sustainable markets, physical or digital. I don't know who feels like responding to this idea. Like what kind of institutional change is needed also to improve the situation of artists that is probably in the Corona situation even becoming more precarious, of course.
Yeah. It's the same thing as I said. If it's about that, I mean, as I said, a lot of the artists come here with the idea to be supported, right? And this can be on different levels. So one could say that it could be on the level of finding a different place in their career or in their path, in their trajectory, but also making exhibitions or producing, etc. But also in terms of the next step. So how can you give them a platform so they can grow or within a network setting, let's say. So that can be problematic if you put against that this idea of but what does that mean, you know, in a world where the art market has to change, you know? The Corona crisis has shown us, in fact, that the art market has transitions, let's say, into something else. It's much more uncertain. The same thing with museums, the same thing with institutes that show work. The question here is, will this be exacerbating? What will be the end of that? And if you add to that also what's been already said about those museums already having to exchange their place on the ladder of attention because of other media. So there's a lot of things that are pushing and having an effect on these structures, right? So something has to happen there. So the question here is, what do we do? what are we going to do with that? Are we going to propose, perform other projects, other ways of thinking, as we are also talking about here? This could be maybe the way Farid works in a more communal way, or are you changing your art practice to be more ecological in the sense of that it becomes more grounded in yourself, in your body, in your... So those are questions, and how does that then translate into selling works, being part of a gallery system, being part of a... I suppose there's a lot of things will change. That's my feeling. But a proper answer, I don't know. But that's if you just put the question forward, that's already good enough. I mean, you can start thinking about it, right? Does that make sense? Did this answer a little bit the question, or am I totally off? No? Okay.
No, I think it did. Can I speak to that just a tiny bit? One of the things, just on a super practical level, one of the things that I noticed as a transformation of habit of mind, maybe, that has happened over the last few years has been, and this also picks up on the comment that Farid, you made. If we start to think of the box, not as, it's sort of the system of, let's say, art institutional commissions tends to be, the box is the institution, the artwork goes inside the institution. But the reality of the fact of the matter is that whether it's because of lack of public funding, not so much public funding, whether it's because of an old model where exposure was enough, museums don't actually have by and large, if they're public institutions, they don't actually have the resources to be able to afford doing that. So if you start to think of the box, not as the institution itself, but actually as a piece of time of an artist's life. And then all of a sudden, which corresponds to a long-term research process that has lots of outputs and lots of artworks and whatever it might be. And then your responsibility as an organization is to actually become one of the puzzles of the floor that underholds that piece of time. And that then lends to an entirely other opportunities to do with collaborating between organizations, but also not organizations. But crucially, it also, it aligns itself more with other, this is common practice when you're thinking about the fact that, certain dance and theater practices have research and development kind of funding. And that by and large, the sort of institutionalized Western art world doesn't that much, except in very specific pockets of place. And so, yeah, that's it. Sorry.
Probably then the last question that also connects to the changing of habitus that Tino and you just mentioned. From Bob Gamper. How can the museum become a space of communal healing and rehabilitation in times of failing and exhausted healthcare systems? Yeah, I mean, also the rhetoric, I think, of the policy is quite somehow going also into this metaphor of comparing museum with institution that helps people to improve mentally, because we had here in Germany the discussion about opening of museums during the COVID crisis, and politicians were saying, people who are mentally exhausted and feeling not that good psychologically need to go to, or we need to open to the museums so that they could go and enjoy art. So this is also interesting somehow.
But that's
rhetorics taking.
That's different than the museums taking a position of what to do within those changing circumstances, right? I mean, it's been said already. I thought it was very beautiful. I think Diane said it, that the shift from object to people, right? So if museums have people central to their practice, then already healthcare or care needs to be central in that, right? So I mean, and I suppose, as we see here, a lot of the work that we have here within sort of the crisis management of the corona crisis has to do with physical and psychological mental health issues. So I suppose, that's very much connected, you know, healthcare or having a lack of healthcare, and you know, having a system of, like museums now are being seen sort of as an entertainment structure, or a structure from which you then gain some form of pleasure, in a sense. But I suppose that there's much more, as the things that are being said here, that would then see museums not as only that kind of space, but really spaces of communion, spaces of gathering, spaces of exchange, spaces of change itself. So I suppose that could be a transition where when there's a lack of healthcare, that could then substitute, right?
If I can add something, like we should start thinking about self-care as well. Self-care from museum professionals. What I've seen last year was really terrible. I met museum directors and museum professionals really in crisis because globally our nation said that culture was not essential. And so I think it's very important to join forces and care for museums so they can exist in the future. And of course, showing that it is a place of well-being. It is a place where you actually transform and you get inspiration and energy. And this is totally something that is real, and it is true, is proved, and we have this beautiful study from a German laboratory saying it. But at first, before caring, you need to care for yourself, and I think it's something that museums tend to forget lately.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Diane, for picking up also this question. I think it's time to wrap up, and because we would like also to include a short breakout session afterwards. Lucia, would you like to say some words for the closing of discussion?
I think I just wanted to express my deep gratitude to you, Hicham, Farid, Diane, and Tino, in the order in which you appear on Zoom, on my Zoom. And of course, Daria, for your hospitality, and Stefan and Barbara and Jessica, who are somewhere else. So just gratitude, really. And do we want to try and do this breakout session question thing?
Yeah. Okay, let's probably go into breakout session, and we wanted also to include a little overview over the next days, but we can do it also afterwards, I would say, not to lose time now. And let's go into breakout. Just a little note on this, because it's a bit also experiment for us. We tried it today in the morning. We are very excited how it will come out, and we will now randomly be distributed around several breakout rooms, I think of like 10 to 12 persons. And then we can also take, Lucia, your question with us. If you, I can also read it if you would like to.
Let me just say that it borrows slightly from a few people, from all the kind of future generations work that so many of you know so well, from one of Fernando Garcia Dori's exercises from the World Gathering of the International Gathering of World Nomadic Peoples, and from an organization called Moral Imagination. So none of this has been invented. But the question is, you are in the future, let's say 2050, the world is by and large an environmentally just, fair, and balanced place. Either something huge or maybe lots of little things have happened in the arts, science, policy, and institutions that has led to this becoming possible. You are asked the question by a young person who doesn't remember the time before. How did we get here? What helped us get here? And you look away and you begin to remember. And in honor of Tino's repeated exhortation to be incredibly practical, I think that you could take this question in an incredibly practical sense. Anything from paradigm shifts to irrigation systems would be I think, an interesting place to go. So I will maybe copy and paste that into the chat because it's quite a long one.
Great.
Thank you.
Just one note, you can go, if you don't feel like going into the breakout session, you can also go back into the main room. So it's your decision. We will be brought automatically back by the invisible hand of our host, technical host, after 15 minutes. So we have 15 minutes in the breakout session, then we come back and then we can really close the session after that. Also in the breakout sessions, if you have ideas that you would like to write on the Padlet, we will send the link of the Padlet into the session so that you can take notes and leave traces on the Padlet. Okay, let's dive into the breakout session moment. I think that I think that Farid unfortunately won't be able to join us. That's completely okay.